This is a reading of The Boys' War. Confederate and Union soldiers talk about the Civil War. And chapter 9 is titled, We're Going Home. The caption to this picture is William Black was 12 when his left hand and arm was shattered by an exploding shell. He is considered the youngest wounded soldier of the war. By late 1864, most of the giant battles of the Civil War had been fought. Their names sounded like so many thudded cannon booms. Shiloh, Antietam, Chancellorsville, Vicksburg, Gettysburg. Each took a fearsome toll in lives. Each brought the war a step closer to a resolution. Now Sherman was driving his army deep into the South, splitting what was left of the Confederate army and leveling cities and villages in his path. The war dragged along until April of the following year, when the commander of the Confederate Army, General Robert E. Lee, officially surrendered at Appomattox. Elisha Stockwell and his company were marching toward Montgomery, Alabama, when we got the news that General Lee had surrendered, and we lay there all day and celebrated. They lined up the artillery of the whole command and fired a gun just about as fast as one could count. An officer sat on the horse at the right of the gun, and he had a small flag called a Gideon, and every time he made a motion down, a gun was fired. So the firing was as regular as a clock. This sounded nice to us, as if it was the death knell of secession, and it meant the cruel war was over. The next day, Stockwell and a friend gathered up their belongings and began walking home. The ringing of bells and the firing of cannons announced the successful end of the Civil War to the Northern troops and civilians. But many soldiers, especially those fighting for the Confederacy, learned by simple word of mouth. We started back, one Southern boy wrote, and it was not long before we began meeting soldiers from Lee's army. These men stated that Lee had surrendered. At first, we thought them deserters. We pushed forward. The faster we marched, the faster these soldiers came, until at last the courier met a man he knew. This man confirmed the report of Lee's surrender. I turned to the courier and asked, "What are you going to do?" He answered, "I'm going home." And I then said, "I am going with you." He did not object. As both Stockwell and the Southern boy show, soldiers still possessed a remarkable degree of independence. They had signed on to fight until the war was over. Now that it was, the army could not tell them what to do. Thousands of soldiers from both armies simply left camp without waiting to be officially dismissed from duty. Southern soldiers had another reason for taking off so quickly. If they could avoid being captured and forced to surrender their weapons, they would strike a small personal victory for their side. The reception these boys received at home varied, of course. A grand review was held in Washington, D.C. for those Union soldiers who had not wandered off. 200,000 marched up Pennsylvania Avenue and past the president, his cabinet, and tens of thousands of cheering citizens. The Union Army paraded up Washington's Pennsylvania Avenue in a final grand review, 1865. They were proud of their achievements, an officer remarked, and we had the swinging of men who had marched through half a dozen states. Needless to say, this wasn't a typical military parade, as the officer notes. The feature of the column which seemed to interest the spectators most was the attachment of foragers in the rear of each brigade. These men appeared in their native ugliness as they appeared on the march through Georgia and the Carolinas. Their pack mules and horses with ropes, bridles, or halters laden with supplies. It was a new feature in a grand review, but one which those who witnessed it will never forget. The reception given Union soldiers in their hometowns and villages would be smaller, but no less spirited. The boys were not just heroes, they were walking miracles. They had fought and preserved the Union, and they had survived a war that had killed and injured a frightening number of soldiers. This celebration of relief and praise would continue for several years, culminating in a gigantic peace jubilee in 1869. There, a chorus of 10,000 singers and almost 1,000 instruments welcomed the soldiers home with what had been an overwhelming rendition of When Johnny Comes Marching Home. So the song goes, When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. We'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer, the boys will shout, the ladies, they will all turn out, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. And we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Confederate soldiers returned to a somewhat more subdued welcome. The South had lost the war, of course, but most soldiers did not feel defeated. For 4 years, they had held off an enemy that had more money, men, and supplies than their side, and they had inflicted severe punishment on them too. Most felt that if a few things had gone in their favor, they could have carried the fighting on longer and defeated the North. This feeling grew into a passionate belief as time went on. Regiments of Southern soldiers would meet for years to follow, to debate what had happened and why. Adding fuel to this was a simmering anger that a few tried to conceal. 8:30. We are moving briskly towards Richmond, John Delaney would write. And at about 12 in the day, I stepped off the train and proceeded up the street. I shall now attempt to describe my feelings. The city in ruins, the hated and triumphant army of our maligned foes marching through the ruined city. With a raging headache and a swelling heart, I reach my home and hear the curtain falls. But the most common reaction must have been of shock and the changes the war brought to their society, the landscape, and themselves. One Confederate boy struggled for several days to get home, avoiding Union soldiers and eating what he could find along the way. Then he writes, I reached home May 25th, 1865. I found my father and mother working in the garden. Neither knew me at first glance, but when I smiled and spoke to them, mother recognized me with tears of joy, clasped me to her arms. My father stood by gazing upon me in a muted admiration. Their long lost boy had been found. And this picture has a caption that says, The ruins of Richmond, Virginia, as they appeared in April 1865.